What's up, Menace soldiers? I'm an Alliance, and welcome back to another video. Today I'll be covering the 6 best viewing orders to watch the Star Wars films. Now, I actually did a video on this a little bit ago, but I decided since it was like about 2 years ago, it was probably time for an update. So in this video, I'll be covering a bunch of different viewing orders for the Star Wars films, and kind of just talking about their pros and cons. So whether you're new to the Star Wars franchise and you don't quite know where to start, or you're a big fan of the franchise and you just want to change up your usual binge order, this is the video for you. Now, before we actually get this video underway, I just wanted to say that it's incredibly tough to make this without mentioning any spoilers at all. So while I won't be revealing massive story elements or twists, there will be a few story points I'll kind of have to mention in this video to make sense. Now, I'm going to try to keep the first 2 viewing orders I'm going to be mentioning in this video rather spoiler free. But once I'm done with those, I'll put a spoiler alert up and we should be good. So without further ado, sit back and enjoy. So for the first viewing order of our video, we have the release order. This is the viewing order in which the Star Wars movies were released theatrically. That means Episode 4, Episode 5, Episode 6, Episode 1, Episode 2, Episode 3, Episode 7, Rogue One, Episode 8, Solo, and then Episode 9. Now, the pros with this viewing order is that you get instantly placed into the thick of the story. You know Luke is the good guy, you know Darth Vader and the Emperor are the bad guys. There are no overcomplicated politics to follow or backstories you have to know. The film pinpoints who our hero is and what his main mission is. It's also interesting to see where our characters are before jumping back to see how they got to where they were. Now for the cons of this viewing order. The biggest con I would say about release order is that the separate tones are pretty noticeable in the trilogies. And what I mean by this is I've often said that Episode 4 through Episode 6, which is the original trilogy for those who don't know, was more of a space fantasy compared to Episode 1 through 3, which is called the prequel trilogy, feels more like a science fiction, and you'll discover this as you watch the films. The best example I can use is the view of the Force. In the original trilogy, the Force was explained as a mystical energy that runs through all things in the galaxy, while the prequels took a more scientific reason for why the Force exists in the form of midichlorians. Another con I guess you could count is that after you watch the originals, you're supposed to watch the prequels, then jump back to the sequel trilogy, which is Episode 7 through 9. And the biggest issue from this is that you can kind of get a small disconnect from this big time jump, for it's already 30 years between Episode 6 and Episode 7, so if you go from Episode 3 all the way to Episode 7, you're looking at a 50-year time jump, which in turn could feel a bit jarring to some. Now, before I do my final thoughts on release order, I'm going to do the next viewing order first, just because these first 2 viewing orders kind of go hand in hand. So the next one we're going to mention is the episodic order. This is the viewing order in which the Star Wars films are placed canonically in the timeline. So we have Episode 1, Episode 2, Episode 3, Solo or Rogue One if you want to throw those in there, Episode 4, Episode 5, Episode 6, Episode 7, Episode 8, and then Episode 9. Now, the pros for this viewing order, this is the most cohesive way to watch the films. So in order to get the most out of the entire story, beginning to end, this is the best way to watch. I would kind of compare it to reading a book. You start from the beginning and you read to the end. Now, of course, there are a couple cons with this. First off, many key points like twists or major reveals or plot elements become squandered in later films, including one massive one in Empire Strikes Back. You probably already know what I'm talking about, but I'm not going to spoil anything, so yeah. A second con with this is that Vader's story is told before Luke's, and so his character in later films is viewed differently. Instead of a menacing Darth Vader, we see a more broken man, for we've learned what makes him who he is. Now, the last, relatively smallish con, for me anyway, is that Episode 3 is a more action-driven story. This means that the pacing is constantly propelling the story forward. So once you finish with Episode 3 and you go to watch Episode 4 right after it, you'll find that A New Hope's pacing is just a little bit sluggish, which could, in turn, take away from your viewing experience. Now, of course, this could be remedied by watching Rogue One and or Solo, but if you only plan on watching the main films in the Skywalker saga, this could be considered an issue. Now for the last, not really a con, but it's not really a pro either, so I'm just gonna put it here anyways. Something to remember about the prequel trilogy is that they were made decades after the original trilogy. So the lack of effects and CGI may feel a little bit jarring if you go from Episode 3 into Episode 4. Like I said, not really a con, but I do think it's something that could affect people, so there you go. Now for my final thoughts on these first 2 viewing orders. If you are new to the franchise, I highly recommend watching either the release order or the episodic order. If you want my opinion, I think everyone's first binge of these films should be by release order. Now, after you first experience them in release order, rewatch them in episodic order just to get the full story and to fill in any gaps. Now, with that said, this is the point in the video where I'll be mentioning spoilers, for the rest of the viewing orders in this video are next to impossible to explain without mentioning important storylines. So, if you're new to the Star Wars franchise and you don't want to get spoiled, go watch the films in one of the previously mentioned orders. Then come back to this video to see the different and interesting ways you can watch these films. Now with that said, the spoiler warning is up. Let's continue. Now for our next order, and probably the third most popular order to watch these films, it's called the Machete Order. This is the viewing order that serves to add a more thematic element to the Skywalker saga. So here's the explanation on how to watch this. First, the story begins with episode 4. You meet Luke Skywalker and you discover that his father, Anakin Skywalker, was killed by a man named Darth Vader. Luke soon meets Vader and realizes he isn't a very nice guy. Then episode 5 comes along and Luke faces off with Vader. However, we discover that Darth Vader is Luke's father, meaning Darth Vader is Anakin Skywalker. So now that we know of Anakin's fall, we jump back to see how it all happened. So we actually go to episode 2. You can include episode 1 if you want to, but the Machete Order recommends that you skip it just because it really isn't Anakin's story on the account that he only shows up halfway through. Now in episode 2, we watch Anakin slowly embrace the dark side with the death of his mother and the slaughter of the Sand People, and not just the men, but the women and the children too. Next, we go to episode 3, where we watch Anakin's descent into the darkness and we learn of his fate and how he became the Darth Vader we know from the originals. Now from there, we jump all the way to episode 6, where we see the culmination of both Skywalker stories coming to a head. So while before we rooted for Luke to kill Vader, now that we understand and care more for Anakin, we want to see them both come out alive. And then from there, you jump to episode 7, and then so on and so forth, and what have you. Now, on a side note, the Machete Order does recommend that you go against adding Rogue One and Solo to your viewing order, but you could still add them in front of episode 4, just because Rogue One shows where Leia was before episode 4, and Solo shows where Han was before episode 4, so you can kind of throw those in if you want, but you're not supposed to, but you can. Now for the pros of this specific viewing order, Machete Order makes the Skywalker saga's full circle vibe come together and feel more rewarding, for we get to see both Anakin and Luke grow together before finally watching their fates clash. This viewing order also solves the issue with the release order and the massive jump from episode 3 to episode 7. For now, there is episode 6 to kind of soften the blow, and so the jump isn't that big anymore. Now for the con side of this order is that there isn't really any big cons with this story. I guess you could say by doing this order, you kind of place Luke, your original protagonist, in the background for a bit when you go back to the prequels and experience Anakin's story, but that's not really a massive deal because at least you're seeing Anakin's story too. However, a later viewing order I'm going to mention in this video actually fixes this issue, so maybe that's going to be your thing, but we get to that when we get to that. Now for my final thoughts on the Machete Order. I think it's really cool. I think it's awesome to see that fans can kind of take something that was initially placed there and change it up to make it more thematic and just more epic, and I think it's really cool. However, like I mentioned, there is a viewing order later that I think is a little bit better. Like I said, we get to that when we get to that. Now the next two viewing orders I'm going to be covering in this video, I actually created them. I think they're pretty interesting, so I think you guys might enjoy them. So let me know what you think of these viewing orders in the comments below. So for our fourth viewing order, this is called the Flashback Order. This is the viewing order in which we learn where the story is currently, then we jump back to discover how it got to where it is. The story actually begins with episode 7. I know, sounds weird, but bear with me. We start out meeting with Rey and the gang, and we get a good feeling on the current state of Star Wars, especially considering that episode 7 is a soft reboot, which essentially means it's a new take on the franchise while still taking into account the previously established canon. Now at the end of episode 7, we meet Luke Skywalker. From there, we flash back to episode 4 to learn his story. You can choose to throw Rogue One or Solo in if you want, but you don't have to. Then we jump to episode 5 and then episode 6, and at the end of Return of the Jedi, we actually meet Anakin Skywalker. We then watch episode 1, 2, and 3 to figure out Anakin's story, then we flash forward all the way to episode 8, where we meet back up where we left off with our new crew. And then after episode 8, we then continue to episode 9. Now the pros of watching in this viewing order is that this possibly could be the easiest way to introduce kids into the Star Wars universe. For you get a good feeling of where the franchise is now, then you go back to experience where it came from. You essentially get a history lesson on the characters and the story before you even watch episode 8. I also feel that watching in this order might better explain Luke's character development in episode 8. When he talks about the hubris of the Jedi, you had just experienced the reasonings for his views in episode 3, so you could kind of maybe relate with him a little bit more to kind of improve his character plot line in there. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just wishful thinking on my part, but maybe I'm wrong. Now for cons, if you do this viewing order, there is a large leap between episode 7 and episode 8, because after you watch episode 7, you jump back and watch the past 6 films, or 8 if you add Rogue One and Solo. So it's possible you may feel a massive disconnect from our new heroes. Now for my personal thoughts on the Flashback Order, yes, I did create it, but I know that there are some flaws in watching in this viewing order. I personally would not recommend this for the first time viewing, but I would see how some people might, so there's that. Now we jump to our 5th viewing order, and it is called the Net Order. It was initially called the Jump Order by me, but I decided to change it. This is my personal preferred viewing order. You might like it too. So the Net Order is similar to the Machete Order, only Anakin and Luke's stories are switched. So you'd actually start with episode 1, where you'd meet Anakin. From there you'd go to episode 2 and discover who Anakin is as our main hero. This is the point in which you could choose to add Rogue One or Solo if you want. I personally wouldn't for this viewing order, but you can. It's up to you. Now after episode 2, we then jump to episode 4, where we meet Anakin's son, Luke Skywalker. In the beginning of episode 4, we learn that Anakin Skywalker, the main character we just spent the last 2 films watching, had been killed by a man named Darth Vader. So at this point, we're really hoping that Luke finds Vader and kills him to avenge Anakin. However, once we reach episode 5, we discover that Darth Vader is Anakin. So from there, we jump back to episode 3 to find out just how Anakin turned to the dark side and became Vader in the first place. We then jump to episode 6, where we see Anakin's return, and then we go to episode 7, episode 8, and then episode 9. Now for the pros in watching in this viewing order, the story begins with Anakin rather than Luke, making the narrative a little less jumbled than the Machete Order. This also solves the issue of being without the original protagonist introduced, for Anakin is technically with you for the entire story until episode 6. Now on the con side, the biggest con I can think of is that episode 4 is a much more easier film to swallow over episode 1. So episode 4 would be a more easily accessible film to begin on rather than episode 1 and all the extra stuff that goes with it. Now for my final thoughts, overall I personally think the Net Order is superior to the Machete Order, for you get a better perspective on things. For example, you get a more personal feel with Anakin first, so once you discover he'd been killed, you feel more sad and you want Vader to pay for what he did to Anakin. However, you soon discover that Anakin and Vader are the same person, and so you're completely thrown off by the entire situation to the point where you almost feel betrayed by the narrative, and you just have to find out the conclusion and discover how it all happened. So that's why I really like the Net viewing order, and that's why it's my preferred viewing order over the rest. Now for our 6th viewing order of the video, it is called Parallel Order. This viewing order is for people who are less interested in the narrative and more in the themes that run through each of the films. So you go from episode 1, then to 4, then to 7, then you can add Solo if you want, then you go episode 2, episode 5, episode 8, then you go to Rogue One, then you'd watch episode 3, episode 6, and then episode 9. So pretty much you're splitting up the trilogies. You're watching the first films, then you're watching the second films, and then you're watching the third films in the trilogy. That's how it goes. Now for the pros, there's really only one, I think, and it's pretty much that you can just watch the parallel themes in the film play out. So pretty much people losing their arms when they're supposed to, big ships getting exploded at the end of films, you know, just stuff like that. Now for cons, if you watch the films in this viewing order, the story is going to be most likely very jumbled and very confusing to follow. Also, since the themes are very similar in each of the films of the trilogy, you may find yourself getting bored. For example, if you watch episode 4 and then you were to watch episode 7, they're almost the same films, so you'd be essentially watching the same film twice, just kind of changed the second time. For my personal opinion on this, while I do adore the parallels that go through the different Star Wars films, it's like poetry, it rhymes, you know, just like how Jar Jar's the key to all this. The truth is, I wouldn't recommend this viewing order. Don't do this unless, of course, you have watched the film so many times and you don't really feel like watching them again the same way, and you want to change your thing up, then this is probably the one I guess I would prefer. And now for a 7th bonus viewing order. Yeah, you didn't see that coming, did you? This one is just very bad. It's don't watch it this way, but here it goes. So this one is called the Reverse Order, and pretty much you're viewing all the films in episodic order, but you're watching them backwards. So you start with episode 9, then go to episode 8, then 7, then 6, then 5, then 4, then 3, then 2, and then of course, you could probably guess it, you then go to 1. Now, the pros for this, there are none. Don't watch them like this. Don't do it. And on the con side, everything's a con. Like I said, don't watch it this way. And that has been the most popular viewing orders of the Star Wars franchise. But I'm curious, what is your favorite viewing order? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe for more. I really appreciate all the help I can get. Thank you. I love you guys, and I will see you next time. Peace.